This is part 5 of the series on how life evolves. In this lesson, we'll learn how natural selection can multiply species. You'll recall the scenario. We had a population of red bacteria that could only eat green food, but they evolved the capacity to eat orange food. So this is one species evolving a new adaptation in their same environment. It's just that it was environmental change, right? The green food was disappearing. That sets up a new selection factor that causes the evolution of new adaptations to deal with the changes. So again, changing environments then are going to be changing the characteristics of living populations. But now let's change up the situation. And whereas before we had the bacteria living in an environment with the green food and potentially orange food, we're going to take away the orange food. So here we just have the original population eating green food. But again, they're going to be reproducing, and there will be more and more individuals in the population, and that will cause a shortage of the green food. Now, in response to this, and this happens all over the natural world, living things oftentimes expand their range in search of new food and new opportunities. So population pressures forced some of the individuals to explore new environments in search of food. Now imagine that happens. And let's then imagine that in this new environment, that's where they encounter the orange food, or at least the potential orange food. So there might be some green food in this new environment just to keep everybody alive for a little bit. But this environment has plentiful orange food, whereas the original environment does not. So we're going to indicate the original environment down here. This is the population that stayed in the original environment with the green food, but some individuals then explored some new environments in search of new food. Now you'll surmise what's going to happen here. It's that the population that encounters the new environment with the orange food, that sets up a selection for any individuals that can eat the orange food, and we'll get our story of the evolution of the orange food eating trait. So notice then, different environments with different food molecules will select for different traits. And let's break that down a little bit. So take the population that stays in the original environment. Well, natural selection is operating here too. It's just that natural selection will eliminate any mutants that cannot eat the green food. So remember, mutations are happening all the time, and there will be individuals that lose the ability to eat the green food. Well, they will perish and be weeded out by natural selection. So natural selection will be conservative in this environment, maintain the useful adaptation of eating green food. Whereas up in the new environment with the orange food, natural selection will favor any mutants that can eat the new orange food. So selection can operate sort of in a conservative fashion, maintaining the useful traits in a population, but also generating new adaptations to meet new environmental characteristics. Now, biologists would say if these two populations were separated for long enough, at a certain point, we're going to call them two species. Now, bacteria are a little bit different than plants and animals. Plants and animals reproduce sexually. And if this founding population was an animal or a plant species, then the idea is if they get separated in different environments for long enough, and we tried to mate the individuals from both populations, that would fail. At that point, we would say they are separate species. So a species, we can define that as a population of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Well, if enough DNA mutations accumulate in these separated populations where they can no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring, we would say they're two species. In the case of bacteria, they don't reproduce sexually, but we can still sort of use this idea that they would be different types of bacteria. So when populations move to new environments, new selection factors begin favoring new traits. And the continual production of DNA mutations gives living things the potential to evolve adaptations to the many and diverse environments on planet Earth. With so many different environments in which to make a living, natural selection can multiply species over time. And that's where we get Darwin's idea of the tree of life. It's a branching tree. So for Darwin, as you move up the tree, you're moving forward in time. And the fact that we get these branching points here, this is when one species is splitting into two species. And a common way that biologists think that happens is by one population splitting into two different environments, and then they're evolving different adaptations in those separated environments. So on the left here, we see a famous diagram in one of Darwin's notebooks. It's the tree diagram, and he writes, "I think," above it. What a radical idea this was, that species not only could change over time, but that species could multiply over time. So here we see sort of a common ancestral species branching into several daughter species, each of which can branch into even more species. In the diagram here, we show a simplified example of this. We have one ancestral species, and some event happens that will be causing a speciation event, one species splitting into two. And one common mechanism for this that biologists think is going on is that members of one species get split into two different environments. And of course, those two different populations will have different random mutations occurring in their genomes. And then importantly, different environmental selection factors are going to be favoring different traits in those environments. And so we'll get the evolution of different adaptations in these populations. At a certain point, they'll be so different that they would no longer be able to interbreed. And we would say they are two separate species. Well, those species can go on to give rise to daughter species. Again, some kind of event happens where members of one species get split apart into different environments, and you get the evolution of different adaptations to different selection factors. So one species can split into two, and two into four, and so on. Now imagine 4 billion years of this kind of process going on. And you can see how some original life form could branch and diversify into millions of species today. Now, if we compare the genome, that's all the DNA in an organism, of the two populations, we would see that they share most of their DNA because they had a recent common ancestor, but the gene duplication and later mutations would stand out as notable differences in one of the populations. So here's the red bacteria. They stayed in the old environment, and they're capable of eating the green food because they have the transporter gene making that protein channel. But the blue bacteria in the different environment, they also have the gene to make the protein to eat the green food, but they also evolved a new protein to eat the orange food. So if we compared the DNA of the blue bacteria and the red bacteria, they're going to share a lot of DNA. The notable difference will be they have a duplication of gene and some accumulated mutations in that gene. In time, as each population lives in separated environments with different factors selecting different traits, their genomes will diverge even more. Therefore, genome differences can be used to measure the time since a common ancestor. So, if there are only a few DNA differences between these two populations, here and here, then we would infer that the common ancestor is fairly recent. But if there's lots of DNA differences between these two populations, then we would infer a more distant common ancestor, farther back in time. Now, let's see how we can use DNA differences to reconstruct an evolutionary history. So notice we have a graph here. We have the time on the y-axis here, and then we've got some ancestral species here, and they're going to give rise to 4 species shown at the top here. And let's say we're able to sequence the DNA of these 4 different species so that we can compare those DNA sequences. And the idea is that species that have very few differences, so they have lots of similar DNA, we infer that they would have a recent common ancestor. As it turns out, species B and species C have very similar DNA, only a few differences. And so we infer from that, we conclude that they had a common ancestor that was recent. And so by recent meaning there wasn't a whole lot of time for lots of different mutations to accumulate in the separated populations. Whereas species A and D, they have more differences in their DNA sequences. And so we infer a common ancestor that is farther back in time. But now if we compare species A and species B, we will find that there are more differences between A and B than there were between B and C, but fewer differences between A and B than there were between A and D. And so we conclude that the common ancestor of A and B was at some intermediate time in the past. So, because mutations accumulate at some sort of rate or some pace, mutations end up being sort of a molecular clock. And today then we can do DNA analysis between any two species we want, and we can make inferences about how far back in time they had a common ancestor. So here we see the great tree of life. And down here we have Luca, the last universal common ancestor. So because cells can reproduce with heredity, and sometimes mutations introduce new cell traits, the first cells could evolve into ever more complex life forms. But notice the way a tree works is as you go up the tree, the branches diverge. But it turns out there was something fishy, something different happened in history that Darwin didn't quite appreciate. And we saw that in our telling of the early history of life on Earth. So on the left side here were the origin of life, and we have learned that early on now there were many different kinds of bacteria produced by this process of natural selection. So here again we get speciation. One population of bacteria split up into different environments. They'll evolve different adaptations to these different environments, and they will eventually become different kinds of bacteria. And we represented that by these three right here. But then, around 2 billion years ago, we get this phenomenon where two cells seem to have merged into one, the origin of mitochondria. And so this endosymbiosis event is not consistent with the tree metaphor that Darwin introduced, or Darwin gave us, because after all, here we have two species merging into one. For Darwin, the idea was one species can split into 2 or 4 or 6 or 8. Darwin just didn't know at that time that sometimes the branches converge. So at this point, let's pause and read some summary points, and that will complete our lesson series on how life evolves.